believer, but like many at that time, he just doesn't know much about Jesus, but he does believe that he was the Son of God. All right, so what is Luke's purpose for writing this account? It says that he compiled a bunch of information, and then what does he do with all of that information? He puts it in an orderly account. All right, sounds like many of your jobs, doesn't it? You have to take a whole bunch of stuff and put it in a way that makes sense to people. In college, I was a history guy. So what did we always have to do? Research, and then what the professor wants you to do eventually? Put it into a paper. That's where I was really bad. Putting stuff into an orderly account is tough. Luke does this brilliantly. And what we're going to see is some of the themes that he just does wonderfully all throughout. So it's not just throwing a bunch of stuff together, but he's got an order and a purpose to all of that bunch of information. That you will find at the end that it is brilliant. All right, so how did Luke receive the information? Yeah, from all of these eyewitnesses. So he's going to talk to a ton of people who saw Jesus, who heard Jesus, and so a lot of his information is going to be similar to Matthew and Mark's information. By the way, if you were in your Conco's class last year, where did Mark get most of his information? From Peter. So that's why we call these the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Very, very similar. But Luke is going to give a lot of unique stuff. So that's why it's good to study all four Gospels. You can see the unique information they all give. All right, and number 5, what is the benefit? So yes, he is writing to Theophilus, but God obviously wants all of us to be the readers and benefactors of this. So it says at the end there, to have certainty. That's such a key word. So Theophilus is this guy who has some information, but Luke wants him to have certainty of the things that he's already been taught. So all of this is to help Luke, or help Theophilus be encouraged by his faith, to grow in his faith. So I'm just going to give you a bunch of information and put it in a way that makes sense. Okay? All right. I need another reader now. So who can read verses 5 through 25 along this section there? Volunteer, please. All right, Carol. Nice and name.
In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. Now, while he was serving as priest before God, when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great before the Lord. And he must not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. And he will go before them in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared." And Zechariah said to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." And the angel answered him, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you these good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time. And the people were waiting for Zechariah, and they were wondering at his delay in the temple. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them, and they realized he had seen a vision in the temple. And he kept making signs to them and remained mute. And when his time of service was ended, he went to his home. After these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she kept herself hidden, saying, Thus the Lord has done for me in the days when he looked on me, to take away my reproach among people.
Thank you. So before we get to number 6, what is Luke doing at this point? He's trying to help the reader transition from Old Testament to New Testament. So who was the last prophet of the Old Testament? Malachi. Okay, and so how many years from Malachi to Zechariah? It's going to be about 400 years. So he wants to give a clean transition. So a lot of theologians will say Zechariah and John are actually Old Testament people. He's trying to do that transition from old to new here. Okay, so Luke uses what historical reference in verse 5, in the days of King Herod. Okay, what do you guys know about King Herod? Who appointed him king of the Jews? Who's the ruler of the world at this point? Yeah, the Romans are. So Herod, appointed by the Romans to rule over Judea, he's giving us historical fact. This is really, really important. And Luke's going to do this throughout. All these details that he gives, we have to understand that he's trying to make sure Theophilus knows this isn't fiction. This isn't fantasy. This is real history. It's important to know that Luke wants his readers to know that people just aren't making this stuff up as they go along. The eyewitnesses have given him back, and he's putting that against a historical background that is factual, so that us, 2,000 years later, know this is a real history that's going on, not just something people are making up. Okay, so number 7, Luke begins the story in what building then? In the temple. All right, the temple is in what city? Jerusalem, and Mr. Schlie is going to try to draw. That's why you get to class early and you do that stuff before everybody shows up, so not everybody's watching you. Now I have to do it under pressure. Okay. Oh boy. I should have had an assistant come up here. All right. Oh boy. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Does that sound like 7? All right. Wow. Mr. Schlie. That's awful. So the temple area, what do we know about the temple area again? What are they going to do at this altar? That's where they're going to make the sacrifice, correct? All right. What's the point again of the sacrifice? To take away the sin of that person. Pays for that animal or whatever, pays for that sin. What's going to happen to the priest during that sacrifice is going to be blood and soot from the burning and all that stuff is going to get on him. So what does he got to do? He's got to go wash himself, make himself clean. All right? Now the person whose sin has been paid for, represented by that sacrifice, all right? Now they're good with God, so the priest is going to go into this holy area where there's one source of light, and then the priest is also going to break bread at the table of showbread. What does breaking bread mean? You have what with someone? You have fellowship with them. And so this person, because their sin is paid for, now has fellowship with God. Okay? And then what was Zechariah doing at this table? What does it say? He went into the temple after the sacrifice to do what? To burn incense. What does that mean when you burn incense? You're showing that the aroma is pleasing to God. Okay, so the stench of the sinner is gone, and that person now is pleasing to God. Okay? And so that's what Zechariah is doing there in the temple. And so again, this is not fantasy fiction. This is a real place where real things happen. This isn't Narnia. This isn't Middle Earth or any of that stuff. Where's Harry Potter at? I never read the Harry Potter stuff. Where's that? Is that in a real place?
Hogwarts.
Okay. So, but this is actually real historical things happening here. Okay? That's what he's trying to do. So, number 8. What does Luke tell us about the two main people of this section, Zechariah and Elizabeth? What do we know? They're in the line of what important Old Testament person? Aaron. What do we know about Aaron? Who's his famous brother? Moses. And what did God appoint to Aaron and all of his descendants? They would be the priests. Okay, so Zechariah is in that line. All right, so that's important to know. And then there's two words that describe both Elizabeth and Zechariah. They are righteous and blameless, or whatever your version, whatever word they choose, which is an interesting way to describe someone. We're going to get to that in a little bit. What's their physical problem? She's barren, okay, so they can't have children, so that's the physical problem, and it is obviously too late, they are too old to have children at this point. Too old is it? Yes. Yes, Mr. Schlie, too many things are cracking and whatever as I get up and down from the couch. That is obviously an issue. Next week when we go golf, who's golfing next week? Do you know how long it takes Mr. Schlie to warm up now? It's just awful. How many of you are gardeners? I have to actually warm up before I go gardening. That's how bad it's getting to me. Okay, so yeah, anything else that you saw? Those are the answers I wrote down for Zechariah and Elizabeth. Anything else that you saw in this section? Sure.
What is old for back in that time? Is it similar?
Oh, so today what? A woman can't have a child, I don't know, what, 45, 50, something like that. So I would guess it would be the same. Yeah, I don't know. I would think.
It was a high point in his life.
Yes, this was a great, great privilege. I was looking this up earlier. Thank you for that. There's probably around 20,000 priests in Judea at the time. And so you only need so many to do the tasks at the temples. So for Zechariah to get to do this, it really was a big deal. A huge deal for him. Okay? All right, I need people, so we're at number 9. I need people to look up Romans. So we got, well, I already have Romans 3:10 written down. So somebody else look up Romans 1 verse 17. Somebody look up Romans 5 verse 18 and 19. Here's how old I'm getting. While we're looking these up. You know when your kids are little and they keep waking you up at like 5 or 6 a.m. on Saturday morning? And it really would upset me. Now what's happening? My kids are sleeping in, but I'm waking up at 5 or 6 a.m. That's just, now I feel like my dad. Old, waking up way too early. All right, who's got Romans 1 through 17? All right, go ahead.
For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as
All right, so Romans 3:10 says that none of us are righteous. So how could Zechariah and Elizabeth be called righteous? Well, there's our answer right there. They live by faith. Okay? And that's a key concept here. A really key concept. All right, Romans 5. Somebody read verses 18 and 19. Who's got that?
Consequently, just as the result of one trespass is condemnation for all men, so also the result of one act of righteousness is justification that brings life for all men. For just as through the disobedience of the one man the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of one man the many will be made righteous.
Zechariah and Elizabeth should not be called righteous because of themselves. The only way that they can be called righteous is because of their faith in God's promises, which is fulfilled in Jesus. That's the only way. So it's really important to understand why Luke calls them righteous. Okay? All right, let's go to the back side then. Number 10. So, we got to understand the culture. A woman married, doesn't have children. What's the culture going to say about her? This is a curse. So if children are a blessing from God, especially a male child is a blessing from God, you automatically then think, what did that woman or what did the husband, what did they do wrong? What sin did they commit that God is punishing them for? And we see that with other stories, right? People with sicknesses and diseases and stuff. What did that guy do to deserve it? What did their parents do to make that happen? Okay? And so she's being judged by the community as something that's wrong. But Luke calls Zechariah and Elizabeth righteous. So that takes us to a really important theme throughout Luke. What does God judge when he looks at you and I? He looks at our heart, and he's going to see Jesus, and he's going to see faith. Those are the things that God is going to judge you and I by. But what does the religious establishment at that time judge people by? Their outwardly actions, their outwardly things. And so Elizabeth not being able to have a child, she's going to be judged for that. So there's going to be a constant conflict throughout Luke. How the community judges people versus how Jesus judges people. And it's going to be intense. Because who is Jesus going to end up hanging out with and having fun with a lot of times? The very sinners that the religious establishment has condemned. So Luke is already getting the reader to understand this conflict that's going on. Okay? All right, so let's look at that word faith a little bit more. Somebody look up Hebrews 11:1. I bet you a lot of you actually know this one. Hebrews 11:1. Who can look that up? Who's faster, the people on the phones or the people with the Bibles? The people that memorized it. That's the best answer ever. All right, who's going to read for us? Hebrews 11, verse 1. I'm not going to put you on the spot, Sue. No? You could say it? Under all this pressure? Okay, go ahead.
Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen.
Say it again.
Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen.
Things not seen. What does your faith have to go beyond? What you can see and what you can understand. And that's the great challenge. So here is Zechariah, a priest, being called righteous, but what's going to happen to him right now? God is going to do what with him? He's going to test him, isn't he? We're going to see where that faith is, Zechariah. You're going to see where your faith is, Zechariah. I got another definition of faith. I'll actually write this up here. Faith is to know, accept, and trust what? God's Word. You and I know God's Word, right? Do we always accept it? And do we actually trust it? So here's where in my class we would do a trust fall, and I love the way I do a trust fall. I'm not going to do it with you guys. But I would have a kid blindfolded, and I would get them up on a table so that they're facing away, okay? And then I would sneak up 3 kids who they're gonna be the catchers, all right? But this kid doesn't know that those 3 people are behind, and I just say to the kid, "You trust me." And what's the kid gonna say? Of course, you, okay? So I put my hand on their elbow, and I'm out of screen. Is that better? I put my hand on their elbow, and I say, "Do you trust me?" And they say, "Yeah, I trust you, Mr. Schlie." And then what do I start to do? I walk away a little bit. "Okay, do you still trust me?" And they're like, "Yeah, okay, I guess." And then I keep walking away a little bit. "Do you trust me?" And then this is where they know, because what are they thinking at this point? How can he catch me if he's way over there? This doesn't make any sense. And so it's really interesting to see where trust kind of falls apart. And so what do we see with Zechariah? That very thing. All right, so number 12 is where we're at. How did Zechariah respond to the news of his wife bearing a child? Look at verse 18. What does it say there? He questions it. And in that question, he's really wanting what from God? Proof. Prove it to me, God, that this is going to actually happen. Okay? So there is considerable doubt because this doesn't make any sense. So the guy who was called righteous by Luke actually is more like you and I, right? Struggle in faith sometimes, many times. All right, so who else responded in a similar way to this miracle birth? Remember Genesis 18? What story in the Old Testament? Sarah and Abraham. Exact kind of story. How many children did God say Abraham would have? As many as the stars in the sky. Oh, that sounds great, but I don't have any kids at all. What are you talking about? What's wrong? See, I was a basketball player in high school and college, and I was blessed and cursed with peripheral vision. Don't they teach that in basketball? You gotta see the court, right?
Ball in the man.
See ball and man and see everything. So, number 14, compare Zechariah and Elizabeth to Abraham and Sarah. What are some things we can write down here? They both believed in the one true God, right? And they certainly weren't polytheists or anything like that. Can't none of that stuff. Believed in the one true God. But neither one had what? Children. And so when God promised you're going to have a child, what did both Abraham and Zechariah go through? A faith struggle. You remember what his solution was? As years go by and no child, what is wading through the faith sometimes? We start to do what? It's never going to happen. Take things into our own hands. What did Abraham do? Had a child with, what was her name? Hagar. Okay. So a faith struggle was there. All right. So they both are very similar in these stories. Okay. Again, what is Luke trying to do with the beginning, Luke chapter 1? The transition from old to new. You see so many similarities here. Okay, Old Testament to New Testament. All right, number 15. So what's the name of that angel? Gabriel. And then we see number 16, Gabriel is also going to be in the book of Daniel. We're not going to look this up, so I'll just give you guys the answer here. So Daniel chapter 9, verse 21, and 1 verse 10. The time of appearance is during prayer time. How many times do the Jews pray a day? Anybody know? 3 times a day. Okay, so you have the morning prayer, and then the noon prayer, and then the afternoon prayer. So this was at the afternoon prayer. All right, Daniel 10, 7 through 11, and Luke 1, 12. Daniel and Zechariah's reaction. Both were full of what when they see the angel? Pretty much like every story where an angel appears. Fear, trembling. Does anybody actually know how Daniel literally responded? Have you ever seen anybody so scared that they can't move? Have you ever witnessed that? That was Daniel. He was so scared he couldn't move, and he actually fell over. And he couldn't what? He couldn't speak. He was just that scared. Okay, that's a pretty intense scene. And so that happens with angels a lot. So let's go to the next page. Daniel 9, verse 20 through 22. How Gabriel introduces himself. I always love this. Angels just don't knock on the door and walk in and all that stuff. What do? They just simply poof, appear. That would throw all of us off, right? But then to calm the people down, what do they oftentimes do? They say they say fear not, and they usually say their name, okay, to calm things down. So that's Gabriel. What happened to both Daniel and Zechariah? They both became mute. So Daniel, because he was so scared, and Zechariah, we'll get into this in a little bit, because he was kind of punishing from God, so to speak. And then what was the reaction of Daniel and Zechariah? When the promise then finally gets fulfilled, what were both able to do again? They were both able to speak again. Okay? So again, Luke setting up that transition from old to new. These are stories that happen in the Old Testament, that are happening again here in the New Testament. So this should be nothing new to a lot of these readers. All right, so Zechariah, where is he when the angel appears? He's at the place where they're going to burn incense. So we just talked about that. In fact, Luke's really specific here. Where was the angel? It says on which side of that altar of incense? On the right side, it says. That's kind of interesting that Luke gives that really specific detail there. All right, so what does the burning of incense give a picture of? Again, God is pleased with his sacrifice. Okay, he's on the right side. Usually the right side means the good side, the blessed side. Okay, which hand do you bless your son? Your right hand. Okay, what is Benjamin? Son of mine. Right.
Remember they have that.
It's out of my right hand. It's right hand.
Okay, have you ever been caught between two women? Yes, the Benjamites were left-handed, but I believe the name of the meeting is set right. But if you want to argue with me, that's fine. She's going to go to Google, and that'll straighten us all out. Okay? Oh, that's good stuff. God is, so Psalm 141, verse 2, God is pleased with the sacrifice. Okay? So again, that's what the burning of incense means. By the way, what did God say about his son at his baptism? This is my son, with him I am well pleased. It's the exact same thing. Okay? So Luke's going to tie all this stuff together. All right, when is the burning of incense? It's during the evening sacrifice, during the evening prayer, so right at about 3 o'clock p.m. By the way, when did Jesus die on the cross? At what time did he finally die? It's going to be right around 3. Okay? So again, it's all ties together. So, number 18. 18, what's the good news? What the good news of God turned Zechariah from what? He was scared and troubled to what? What does it say there? It's going to turn to joy and gladness. And again, that's going to be a continued theme throughout Luke. In fact, what do you remember about the shepherds? We're going to learn that next week. They went from scared to death seeing the angels to rejoicing that they saw the baby Jesus. Okay, it's going to be a continued theme. All right, so number 19. Why is Zechariah not able to speak? There's actually lots of theories about this. Why did God use that particular consequence, punishment, whatever? So I'd kind of like to hear yours before I give you two of my answers. Why do you think? By the way, we'd love to have that power over. If you're going to use your words in that way, then I'm going to take away that ability. That's good. Okay? Any other thoughts on why we need all the punishment God gave in the Old Testament to people? He makes them need.
It may not have been time yet to tell the people that the Savior was coming.
Okay, good. I like that. Sure, go ahead.
I thought that, so he used his words to, doubt that he
Yeah.
was learning that. And so his heart wasn't prepared yet to be a witness that would kind of like Carol was
He
saying.
needed time.
He needed time to work this through because his message was, his silent message was more powerful than his words probably would have been at that time.
Okay. All right, here's my two answers that I got from people smarter than me. The time to fulfill promise, so God usually makes a promise, but he doesn't fulfill it until later. That time of waiting is oftentimes called the silent period. Okay? And then as you guys were saying, those without faith, especially in the end, what will God make them? Silent. Okay? So you guys are right on with those answers. Okay? So I'll repeat that. The time to fulfill promises often is called a silent period. And then those without faith are often made silent. Okay. So those are two theories. So if you like a different answer, that's fine. All right, so the promise of John. What are the duties of John the Baptist? It says that he's going to turn people to God. What's the fancy word we usually use for turning people to God? The word convert. Convert literally means to turn someone around. You're going away from God, and what does he do? He literally turns you toward him. Okay, that's going to be John's job. He's going to prepare what? He's going to prepare the people for the Messiah. He's going to prepare the people for the Messiah. And when we get into John's message later on, what's going to be the key thing he's going to tell people to do? Get prepared. Repent. Okay? And that's going to create conflict. All right? And I also just wrote down that this is nothing new. This is what the Old Testament prophets did. So John is just a continuation of the Old Testament prophets. And that's why we often say John is actually the last of the Old Testament prophets. So the transition from Old to New is complete through John. Okay? Because obviously, he's not just talking about some distant future of the Messiah. The Messiah in John's ministry is actually here. Okay? So that's why he's the last of the Old Testament prophets. All right, number 21. What will give John the ability to do his job? Like anybody who ministers for God, what gives them their ability? Power of the Holy Spirit. And it says that he will have the same spirit as who? Elijah. That's going to play important later as well, because what are some people going to say? Are you the second coming of Elijah? That's going to be important as we study John later on. Yes, he has that same spirit of Elijah to do God's work. Okay? All right, we're at the end there. All right, I need another reading now. Somebody read for us, verses 57 through 80. Everybody's saying, thinking to themselves, Carol, great job. Thank you.
When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." He said to her, "There is no one among your relatives who has that." Then he made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue was loosed, and he began to speak, praising God. The neighbors were all filled with awe. And throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about these things, all these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, "What then is this child going to be?" For the Lord's hand was with him. His father Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied. Praise be to praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come and he has redeemed his people. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David.
Okay, let's stop there. That's what we don't need to go all the way through 80. Even though read the rest of Zechariah's song is really, really good. Okay? All right, so number 22. Who did the people give credit to for Elizabeth's birth, giving birth? Credit to God, credit to the Lord. What did they all know in that community? This is a miracle child. There's no way she should be giving birth. So this is an act of God, and we will recognize that. So what was done with the boy on the 8th day? What every Jewish male has to go through. Circumcision. Okay? It's clearly a very loyal, religious family, Zechariah and Elizabeth. Of course, they're going to do that. And we'll study later, when we study the circumcision of Jesus, what all that means. 24, what name did the people assume the boy would be called? Zechariah. Which named the firstborn son. Okay, but instead, his name is John. Who gave the child the name John then? Luke 1, verse 13, going way back to the appearance of the angel. The angel who said, "No, the name is John." You can see there what the name John means. Then number 26, what was Zechariah able to do when the child was born? Now he's able to speak. Okay? And now he can clearly tell people the goodness of God, which is interesting to me. Because in our human nature, what do we often want to do when a punishment is over? We want to lash out at the punisher, right? And Zechariah doesn't do that here. He actually blesses God when he speaks. So 27, Zechariah blessed God. Why? Because the promise was fulfilled. And that's just a great example of how you and I should be. Because what does Hebrews say oftentimes? Discipline means sometimes you're going to have to go through a difficult situation. And that can be hard sometimes. But we got to see the good in that. And Zechariah sees what happened there as good. We talked about the miracle of John's birth. I find this really interesting. It says the message or the word of this went out to the whole hill country of Judea. All right. Who's got maps in the Bible? If you've got a map in your Bible, you can look up what the hill country is. But I'm not drawing that. But it's pretty, the north end of Judea, all the way to the south end of Judea, is the hill country. Okay? Pretty much down the middle from north to south. Okay? So this is a big area of Judea. Okay? So the word was out there that a miracle child had been born, and this child was special. And how many disciples then did John end up having? Quite a few. Okay? The word was already out that this child was important. All right, so number 29, what were the people's responses to the whole story? It said that, Luke says that it lay in their hearts. That people pondered on this and thought about this. What does this all mean? I mean, this is really a special moment. And so they started to wonder, why did God give Elizabeth and Zechariah this special gift? There's got to be a reason for it. And so when people start following John, and John's telling them to repent and get ready for the Messiah, that process has already started with his birth. That's why it's important. All right, so number 30. Who did Zechariah talk about first when he expressed his feelings, his thoughts in a song? He actually starts talking about not his son, but Jesus. And so that's why I want you to read through Zechariah's song. Such an important, great poem, song that he does. Because what is the first thing that he starts talking about that Eric read? He says that God has redeemed his people through a horn of salvation. What in the world is a horn of salvation that he's referring to? All right, so let's talk about this for a second. When you think of animals that have horns, what do they use those horns for? Okay, either the defense or as a weapon. Think of a rhinoceros horn. Okay, it's a sign of strength, power. Okay, so think that way with a horn, strength and power. When the Old Testament prophets would anoint a king, what would they use to anoint the king? So King David was anointed by Samuel. What did they use? A horn filled with oil. So the horn also represents authority and power. Okay? And so these are all references toward a king. And so what is Zechariah saying in Jesus being the horn of salvation? These are that baby Jesus who will come later is going to be that Messiah, that king of theirs. And then finally, on the altar, on the four corners of the altar, what was actually fastened to those corners? A horn. And so there's a story of King David's son, Adonijah, who wanted to be the next king, but who was appointed as the next king when David was gone? Solomon. So how do kings feel about someone who's trying to take their power? You killed this person. So Adonijah wanted to be king, but Solomon was the rightful king. So what was Adonijah worried about? Solomon might kill him. So where did Adonijah go for protection? Where's the one place he could go to get protection from the king? He went to the altar and he grabbed onto the horn. That was his sanctuary. So not only is Jesus the Messiah, our powerful king, he is the one Savior that we have from our ultimate enemy, sin. So that concept of the horn of salvation, really important when Zechariah brings up here. Okay? All right, so we are almost out of time. Any questions or thoughts on Luke chapter 1? Other things that you can read besides Zechariah's song. Read Mary's song. Okay? That's really important because we're going to study that a little bit next week when the angel did Mary. We'll talk about that next week. And Hannah's song. Read those songs. All of them beautiful in 1 Samuel chapter 2. Beautiful songs in Scripture. Okay? All right, so we'll continue next week by talking about Mary, the appearance of the angel to her, and getting the news to the birth of Jesus. Okay? Questions, thoughts, anything? We're good? Okay. All right, let's finish the prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for giving us messengers like Gabriel, messengers like John. Help us to grow in our faith through that message. And when we do mess up and we do struggle to trust, help us again to always repent. Lord,